What's up, everybody, and welcome back to A Beer a Day with TK. It's a Saturday evening here in Findlay, Ohio, and I'm getting ready to do something a little bit different. For those of you that are familiar with my channel, you've probably seen me review beers over the last 6 months or so, but I really enjoy it. It gives me an opportunity to try new beers and, communicate with you guys, the audience, and kind of see what you think about the beers, what's going on with beer in your neck of the woods, and it's been something I've really come to enjoy. On YouTube, I look at a lot of beer videos. Some of the other stuff I tend to look at is serial killer videos. So I watch a lot of stuff that deals with criminal justice issues in general. As I mentioned before, I am a criminal justice professor. My background was in law enforcement, and I went to law school. And not surprisingly, I teach classes that kind of tie into these two areas. So, like I said, I'm an associate professor of criminal justice at a small university here in the Midwest. I teach classes on the courts, policing, criminal investigation, Fourth Amendment search and seizure, do comparative criminal justice, where we look at global justice systems. But my most popular class, semester after semester, is my serial killers class. Generally speaking, the CJ classes draw people from criminal justice. Sometimes you get a few social kids and political science. But when I do a serial killers class, you have people from every academic discipline showing up. It's really strange. Generally, when I walk into a class of 20 students or so, I probably know 18 of the 20s. I've had them before. When I do serial killers, I walk in and it's kind of a crapshoot. You never know who's going to be in there. In the past, I've had exchange students. I've even had other professors take the course. And I think that kind of says something about us, that we're really interested in this concept of true crime. We're interested in this idea of serial murder. In my academic history, like I said, I've taught this class. I've also engaged in some research when it comes to serial killers, specifically when you deal with an area that they call murderabilia. Those that collect like to call it true crime collectibles. Those that kind of demonize it would call it murderabilia. So there are folks out there that collect items that are associated with serial killers. For most of my life, I've been a collector of one thing or another. When I was young, I collected sports memorabilia. I still do. Baseball cards, football cards, autographs, that kind of stuff. As I got a bit older and started drinking beer, I started collecting breweriana, right? So brewery memorabilia, whether it's labels from, beer cans, bottles, taps, whatever it is. I started collecting these things. So I kind of understood that those that collect things, you kind of have something within you that draws you to collect these things because it's interesting. I watched a video, it was out on Netflix at the time, talked about serial killer collectibles in this industry, and it really intrigued me. It made me wonder why people were collecting these types of things, what were they collecting, and why was there so much backlash against it? Now, I completely understand that there's a lot of folks that say it's glorifying criminals, serial killers, kind of people that have engaged in horrific kinds of activities. But I really don't know that it's something that laws should be enacted to prohibit and stuff like that. I did a little bit of research there. I actually wrote to a number of serial killers. Surprisingly, a lot of them did respond. And I kind of asked them, what are you getting out of this? I understand that if somebody's selling your paintings or, memorabilia, they're getting cash. So that's easy, right? I mean, that's good old-fashioned capitalism. Somebody's making money. But what do you get out of this? And a fairly well-known serial killer told me it kind of keeps you in the public's memory. And it really stuck with me that serial killers are somewhat afraid, I guess, to fade away into the past. So it's kind of an interesting concept, and this is some of the stuff that pushed me into the area, the academic area of studying and learning more about serial killers and serial killer memorabilia. So for this series here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine two things that I really enjoy. I'm going to combine beer, and I'm going to combine my interest in serial murder. And I'm going to take some of the stuff that I say in the classroom, some of my lectures, some of the topics that we discuss, and I'm going to share them with you. I hope it's something you find of interest. It's a little bit different, I guess. But I figured it would be a break from kind of the mundane beer reviews that, I do and many other people do. It's something a little bit different. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to review this beer here. This is Chilcote's 2020. This is a milk stout from the Findlay Brewing Company here in Findlay, Ohio. And this is 6.6% ABV. And can't tell if that's 38 IBUs. The marker ran a little bit there. I picked this up today at lunch. Figured I'd give it a shot with the first episode. So what I'm going to do today, and what I'll do throughout this series, is before I actually talk about any specific serial killers, I'm going to do kind of an overview. There's lots of videos that tell you about serial killers and tell you about the things they did, explain their exploits, go into great detail about their murders, the gory graphic details. And what I'm going to do is kind of start before that. I'm going to take more of an academic approach. And what we're going to do is analyze the serial killer. So sure, we'll discuss what they've done, but we're also going to break down the way in which we're going to analyze them. So first things first, I think what you need to do is figure out what exactly is a serial killer. And not surprisingly, there are multiple competing definitions out there as to what constitutes a serial killer. So the FBI has a definition. A definition was offered via legislation in 1998 in the Protection of Children from Sexual Predators Act. And even academics have offered definitions. So the book that I use when I teach my class is one called Serial Murder, and it's put out by a pair of professors called the Holmeses. One is from University of Louisville, and the other Central Florida. I like their book. I like their definition. I like the way they break down serial murder and kind of classify it. So that's the approach that I use. There are other professors out there that study this topic. Most notably, Fox and Levin were a team of professors out of Northeastern University, and they do a great job. They have some, really good literature out there as well. I just tend to favor the Holmeses, so that's the approach that I'm going to use. So, if you've heard of it, if you've seen the way they do things, that's where the basis for my analysis is going to come from. So, when we talk about the definition of what is serial murder, the definition I use in my classes, and the one that I think it makes the most sense, is the one offered by the Holmeses, which is the killing of 3 or more people over a period of more than 30 days with a significant cooling down period in between the killings. So we kind of have a temporal element that we have to have at least 30 days pass, so more than 30 days. We have a body count, so number of 3 victims, and there has to be these cooling down periods. So in another episode, I'll talk about the difference between mass murder, spree killings, and serial murder. And once we get to those, this will kind of make a little bit more sense, I guess. When you look at the way this definition is set up, you have, again, the temporal element, we have these breaks in between the killings, and we have a body count, a number of victims that have to be killed in order to be considered a serial killer. Now, when you take that definition and you kind of apply it to the world, and we say, okay, who could fall into this category? What's kind of interesting is tons of folks could fall into the category of serial killer. So obviously folks like John Wayne Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, and these guys fall into the category of serial killer, but so do a lot of others. And this is where it kind of gets odd. If you think about the Wild West, Jesse James could fit this definition, right? Billy the Kid could fit this definition. So could Al Capone, so could most of the gangsters of Chicago and New York. But if I were to ask you, are they serial killers? The answer is no. Maybe they fit the definition, but they're not the same thing that we kind of think of when you say serial killer. And this is where it gets a bit odd, right? If we have a definition that kind of defines, what serial murder is, why is it we don't view some of these folks in the same lens as we do, say, Gacy or Dahmer? And I think a lot of it has to do with the motive and the intention. So when we deal with serial killers, right, in the popular culture, the idea is basically these are folks that are killing for their own enjoyment, whether it be, sexual or power control, whether there's financial motivations, whatever it is, they're killing for some kind of enjoyment. Where we view mobsters, Wild West outlaws, and these folks as kind of engaging in crime, and murder is kind of the side effect or something that comes with the territory. Whereas serial killers, killing is the primary motivation. These other things tend to be maybe ancillary. The first thing we got to do is kind of wrap our minds around this framework before we discuss serial killers. One of the other things that I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about some of the myths that persist around the serial killer culture. So, let me open this beer up. I've been waiting too long here. Whoa. So this is a nice dark milk stout, right? Pouring quite nice. The first thing that I'll talk about is one of the myths is that everyone is at danger or at risk of being killed by a serial killer. We've probably all seen on the news at different times. Maybe a serial killer is on the loose, or a criminal in general, right? And we think, are we at risk? Am I at danger? At different times throughout history, we go back to the Son of Sam days in New York. People were terrified on the streets that they might be victimized. When Ted Bundy was rampaging around the United States, sorority girls were living in fear that they might be victimized because of someone like Ted Bundy. And it kind of begs this question, are we all at risk? And the answer, quite simply, is no. We're not all at the same level of risk. While there are certainly serial killers that kind of kill rather indiscriminately, I know if you see the Richard Ramirez series, the Night Stalker series that's been on Netflix recently, his victims are kind of all over the place. We have men, we have women, we have people of different ages, different ethnicities, different backgrounds. So they seem to be a little bit more random. But for the most part, most serial killers have something called an ideal victim type. What this means is that there's some specific traits that most of the victims have in common. Now, those traits could be something physical. So maybe you prefer small-built females with red hair, right? So that would basically mean if you're not a small-framed, red-haired female, you're not at risk because this serial killer is only targeting a certain subset of people. Now, it could be more general. So sometimes serial killers frequently target people, sex workers, prostitutes, or people that use drugs, people that live on the streets. And there are a number of reasons why they may choose these folks as targets. One would be, in general, if someone goes missing who's a street person or drug user, very frequently the police don't put up the same effort to find those folks when they're reported missing as you would if a young boy or girl was snatched out of their bedroom. And we could argue about the ethics and the morality of this, but I would say that it's pretty much a fact. One of the things that comes with the street life and drug use is people are transient. You don't really rely on them as much. They may disappear or go from place to place. So it kind of comes with the territory. One of the other things that makes prostitutes specifically an ideal group is if you want to target someone for serial murder, you have to find a way to get close to the victim. Now, of course, you can drive up and snatch them off the street, but you run a great risk when you engage in that kind of activity of getting caught. So what else might you do? Lure someone into your car. Now, the reality is some of the serial killers look quite normal, look like the average guy or girl next door. When the neighbors are interviewed, they say, such a quiet man, I never would have thought this. Others look like crazy serial killers, right? Others certainly look like somebody you really wouldn't want to be alone with. Now, what makes prostitutes specifically very unique is that you can probably pull up in your car if you have one, say, hey, hop in the car, and they generally will, even though you are a stranger. And what are you going to do next? Probably try to get out of the immediate vicinity to engage in whatever kind of activity you're luring them to believe that you're paying to engage in. So if you pick somebody up and you drive to a park or down a dark alley or something like this, the victim may not realize that anything's going to happen until the serial killer actually strikes. So in that regard, I suppose they would be ideal victims for a serial killer because it's a group of individuals. You can easily get into your vehicle, and then you can go to a secluded area, and then you can strike. Again, we could argue about the morality of it and all these types of things, but this is the reality. In many instances, the victims are drug users and prostitutes. So, are we all at risk? Not really. Again, whatever this ideal victim type class is, are the folks that are at risk. So, if you do have a serial killer on the loose in your town and they're targeting prostitutes or they're targeting drug users, the class of folks that would be at risk would be prostitutes and drug users. If you're a 12-year-old boy, you're pretty much safe. You're not the target of the serial killer. That's nice. Chilcote's 2020, like I said, it's milk stout. I'm a big fan of milk stouts. They tend to be nice and sweet, and then you have that roasty malt thing going on. So this is a nice beer to start off with. All right. I want to get back to the ideal victim type kind of stuff and the idea that we're all at risk. Other than the fact that serial killers tend to have ideal victim types, and if you're not, if you don't have the characteristics of that ideal victim type, you're probably not at risk. There are other factors that somewhat come into play. When we look at the victims of serial killers historically, overwhelmingly the victims are female. Now, that doesn't mean that men can't be the victims, just that more times than not, the victims are female. So that would tend to suggest women are more at risk than men, right? The other thing we find is if you look at the ages of the victims, usually the elderly and the very young aren't targeted. So again, I'm sure someone's going to jump into the comments and say, well, this serial killer only killed old ladies, or this one only killed young kids. Yes, I know. I'm talking in an aggregate here and on kind of, a big picture kind of view of serial killers. For the most part, the elderly and the young are left out. So we can kind of eliminate those groups for the most part. For males, physically fit males are often left out, and I'm sure there's obvious reasons why it must be much more difficult to try to subdue and kill a large physically fit male, maybe than a smaller female or something, I guess. So, when we look at the groups of folks that are most likely to be targeted, for the most part, young fit men are out. Men in general usually are out. The young and the old are out. And what are you left with? For the most part, females, I'd say teenage through, maybe 50s. And again, there are serial killers that have targeted men, but for the most part, they tend to fall into other subgroups as well. So if you look at somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer, he, for the most part, targeted homosexual males that he met at a certain, in a certain area in Milwaukee. So, this is just kind of the breakdown. It really depends which serial killer we're looking at to say, are you at risk, right? So if you're looking in the area where Bundy was stalking and preying on his victims, they were primarily young men in homosexual clubs in Milwaukee. So who's the ideal victim type? Who's the target? Men who frequent those bars. So this idea that we're all at risk and the serial killer's just randomly snatching people up and killing them, there's really not a lot to it. Again, I do know there might be some serial killers that are random and all over the place, but I'm talking about, again, in an aggregate, for the most part, the ideal victim type is important. So at any given time, we're not all at risk, or at least not equally all at risk. All right, let's go on to the next one. The FBI is involved in all serial murder cases. As a former law enforcement officer, one thing that I'm keenly aware of is that there is a lot of competition between agencies. So if you deal with local PD, county sheriff, state police, federal agencies, obviously all these men and women are working hard. You work on investigations, you work on cases, and when you crack a case or you make a big arrest, you want the credit for it because you put that work in. Traditionally, this has been something that has kind of hindered law enforcement efforts. I always used to call it the secret squirrel mentality, where agencies or officers wouldn't share information with each other because they viewed it as their investigation. Now, since post-September 11th, this has changed. You have a lot more cooperation and sharing of information, and with advances in technology, obviously a lot of this information can be disseminated to police departments all over the state, country, world in seconds if you need to. So if you have some information to share, disseminate, it's pretty easy to do so. That being said, I think that the popular media kind of pushes this narrative that the FBI is involved in all of these serial killer cases. And here's the reality. We've seen the series Mind Hunters has been on Netflix. It kind of it details the behavioral science unit that was up with the FBI, and those folks do some phenomenal work and have been, they've been a part of some really big investigations. That being said, when you look at law enforcement in general, there are so many more state and local officers, for the most part local. The overwhelming majority of law enforcement officers in the country are county and local level. And state's probably the smallest if you looked at them as a group, and then the feds are in between. But if we look at these in large groups, there's many times more local PD on the streets than there are FBI agents. So when we talk about the FBI is involved with all serial murder cases, they're not. Some are obviously on the radar and they're engaged in them, but for the most part, serial killers are often caught by the average cop on the beat who stumbles across something. And then as you investigate further, you find out, oh my God, this is some serial killer. So while the feds are involved in some instances, for the most part, it's local cops. So say, even, for example, you look at something like, the Timothy McVeigh incident. It's not a serial killer, right? This is a mass murderer when he set off the bomb at the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. Was pulled over by an officer because of a problem with his license plate. So it wasn't some counterterrorism expert or some group of feds hunting him down across the country. He got pulled over for something rather innocuous. And this isn't uncommon. So there was a team of serial killers called Lake and Ing operating in California some years ago. One of the problems with Mr. Ing was he was essentially a kleptomaniac, would steal things all the time, but wasn't very good at it. He used to get caught all the time. So even though he was engaged in a number of serial murders, fled from the United States to Canada, the thing that was his undoing was he was caught for shoplifting. So as much as I think we'd like to believe there's these great chases and police takedowns where the feds are involved, oftentimes serial killers are detected and arrested for rather innocuous kinds of things or minor events, and then it kind of leads to something further. So the myth that the FBI is engaged in all the serial murder cases is false. They're not in everything, obviously. Now, another myth that persists is that serial killers come from abusive backgrounds, right? A lot of people think to engage in the kind of depraved and barbaric activities that many of these folks do, you had to have a hell of a childhood. Terrible things must have happened to you. And, like in most instances where you see all serial killers come from abusive backgrounds, no, it's not the case. While you can certainly look at a number of serial killers and say, wow, they had terrible abusive childhoods, and there's no surprise that they turned out the way they did. So, for example, if you look at Eileen Wuornos, she was physically and sexually abused from the time she was a young girl. She was engaging in incestuous relationships with family members, was kicked out of the house at a very young age. All kinds of horrible things happened to her. When you learn about her history and her background, you really come to see her as a victim. And you do feel sympathetic towards her to some extent, because you see all these horrible things that happened to this young girl and then see what she became and say, well, kind of someone should have seen this coming, right? This is something that maybe we could have foreseen. And again, there are countless other serial killers. We can look at their background, and they were victims of psychological, emotional, physical, sexual violence, and bad things happened to them. Yet there are others that had relatively normal lives. There's a series of interviews with Jeffrey Dahmer and his father Lionel that are on YouTube, and he kind of discusses what his life was like growing up. And Lionel, like any father whose son turned out to be a serial killer, I'm sure is racking his brain thinking, is there something that I did? Is there something I missed? What did I do to make this happen? And Jeff basically tells him, I had a pretty decent childhood. I had a fairly decent life. And if you look at it, I know his parents got divorced, but he was a bit older, and certainly divorce rates are at about 50% now, right? So if just having your parents get divorced was the impetus to become a serial killer, we'd all be doomed to be a nation of serial killers. And Jeff kind of talks about it and says, I wasn't the coolest kid in school or these types of things, but nothing really that bad happened to me. So if we talk about, the idea that they all come from abusive backgrounds, it's not the case. Certainly some have, but certainly some had relatively normal upbringings and still engaged in this type of behavior. All right, third one, or I guess the fourth one now, all serial killers kill for sex. Now, what's kind of interesting, when we talk about serial killers and we look at the definition put forward by the Holmeses, so we have that body count, 3 bodies, more than 30 days, cooling off periods. We would probably be surprised how many folks fall into the category of serial killer. For those that are interested, if you go to murderabilia, I think it's .org, check them out. It's a really interesting website. It's not just serial killers. A lot of them are just murderers or criminals in general. But you can search males versus females. If you want to search the site for female serial killers, you can. Male serial killers. You can search by country. So if you're interested in serial killers from India or China or Brazil, you can go and search by country. And at the U.S. level, you can even search by state. So I'm originally from the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. If I wanted to learn about serial killers in PA, I could go to this site and kind of look them up. Now, when you go there, you'll start looking through all the different profiles and the information. And the one thing you'll find is there are certainly a lot of serial killers that kill for sexual reasons, or at least have some elements of sex in their, in their murders. It ties into their murders. But if we were to say they all kill for sex, obviously it's not true. Anything that says all is always wrong, right? Now, the serial killers that kill for sexual reasons and kind of do bizarre things tend to get the most press attention. We made movies about folks like that. So if we take somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer, who tried to create a submissive sex slave by cutting a hole in someone's head and pouring acid in there, obviously this is strange and bizarre behavior. Once you add in a sexual element, this is something that the media is going to push. It's going to be on headlines. They're going to make movies about it because it draws our interest. But it's certainly not the only reason that serial killers kill. And we'll get into this in a later episode. There are different classifications for serial killers, and one of the things you kind of look at is, what is their primary motivation? So while there are certainly serial killers that are motivated to kill for sexual reasons, it's not the only reason. Some folks kill for financial gain. So somebody like Eileen Wuornos killed her victims and then robbed them and used the money to support her lifestyle, essentially. Some of them kill for power and control. And this sometimes gets a little bit difficult to analyze, because a lot of times people that are killing for power control may include sexual elements to their crimes. And this is kind of tough, because sometimes when you talk about serial killers that engage in sexual abuse or sexual violence, it's hard to determine whether or not they're doing it for sexual gratification or whether they're doing it for this concept of power control. And the power control ideology is basically the concept that you're killing because you enjoy essentially playing God. You're controlling this person's life. You determine whether they live or die, and you kind of enjoy this. You get something out of this, right? And again, it's hard to tell why a serial killer is engaging in the activities. Is it for the sexual gratification, or is it for this power control element? And again, it's not always easy to tell. Even if they tell you it's one or the other, you can't always believe them. Serial killers frequently lie and mislead us. But there could be other reasons other than sex. So it could be financial gain, power control. And in some cases, this is a very small category, it could be due to some sort of break with reality. So there's a category of serial killers called visionary serial killers, and these folks tend to have psychotic episodes, breaks from reality, and they strike out against others because of whatever the delusion is. So maybe you think the devil is compelling you to kill people. Maybe you think God told you to get rid of this group of people, right? There's no sexual element necessarily, but you're killing because of this psychosis or lapse with reality. So, in short, all serial killers kill for sex? No. Many do. Many have sexual elements to the crime, but there are other reasons, and we'll talk about those in greater detail. I'm going to talk about this beer for a minute. This is Chilcote's 2020 Milk Stout. I went to Findlay Brewing today for lunch and picked up this crowler for the way home. Findlay Brewing does a lot of pretty decent beers that I really kind of enjoy. It's the first time I've had this one, so I figured I'd break it out on the show. It's a really interesting beer. Like I said, it's a milk stout. It is nice and rich. You kind of get a little bit of that coffee taste. You pick up a bit of sweetness from the lactose. And it's really a solid beer. I'm glad I decided to check this one out. All right, let's move on to the next myth. One of the myths is all serial killers abused animals or set fires as children. And what this really comes from is something that was called the MacDonald Triad many years ago. And what it showed was that individuals that shared certain groups of behaviors, it was bedwetting, starting fires, setting fires, and abusing small animals, tended to be more aggressive as adults. So we point to these behaviors in early childhood and say these are indicative of future behavior. And again, this is one of those things where you could say, are there serial killers that set fires as children? Yes. Did they wet the bed? Yes. Did they harm small animals? 100% yes. There are serial killers that fit this profile. At the same token, you could probably point to friends and neighbors, or maybe family members, or maybe yourself, fit some of these criteria, right? Wetting the bed. Usually what happens is small children may injure animals, and you kind of learn empathy, and once you realize that you've hurt the animal, you try not to do it anymore, right? So this is part of growing up. Same with fires. I know as a young boy where I grew up, lots of people were interested in burning things, lighting things on fire. People would take lighters and a hairspray and make a flamethrower, do these types of things. So certainly Lots of young people engage in these activities. Now, for the most part, you tend to grow out of it. You don't persist in harming animals, lighting fires, and bedwetting into later teens or adulthood. But there are a lot of folks that put stock in this and say, well, if someone's engaging in this type of behavior as a child, these are the future serial killers. Maybe they're future titans of industry. Maybe they're the future of anything else, right? There's nothing to suggest that these behaviors in and of themselves lead someone to engage in serial murder. All right, next one is one of the most interesting. Serial killers are from the United States, i.e. this is an American phenomenon. When I first taught this class, first started teaching, I taught it over the summer one year, and had a young lady from Brazil in my class who told me there were no serial killers from Brazil. And I said, want to bet? And she said, no, they're not, they're just Americans. And I proceeded to go to Wikipedia. If you go to, you can just search serial killers by body count, and it'll bring up a whole list of serial killers. And it will show you this list of individuals, and then you have a list of confirmed victims, and then kind of like a speculative list of how many victims do we think they had. And when you look down that list, at the time I taught the class back then, the first American on the list was Gary Ridgway, most prolific serial killer in terms of body count at that point in time, but isn't somebody who really got a lot of attention, didn't really get a lot of the press attention some of the others have. And I think a lot of it had to do with the way he operated. For the most part, he lured prostitutes back to his house or to other places and killed them, dumped them in and around the Green River. So he's the Green River killer. Other than murdering people, which is obviously horrific, he didn't do anything super weird. He wasn't cutting holes in your brain to turn you into a sex slave like Dahmer. He wasn't doing all the BTK weird bondage stuff. He really wasn't doing anything that out of the norm, other than, again, obviously breaking the ultimate taboo. Murder is bad. But there's not a whole lot there that's really, I guess, intriguing compared to some of the other serial killers that are a lot more grotesque in the way they do things. So we start talking about serial killers in different countries. And again, if you look at that list, Ridgway was the top American at that point. And there was probably, easily a dozen or more people ahead of him. And the top folks actually operated in South America. So, I mentioned some of these names to her, like Pedro Rodriguez Filho. She had no idea who he is, even though this is someone with a tremendous body count. I think the confirmed count's 71, and obviously speculative is much more. And if we look at the list, there's serial killers from just about every country you can imagine. So Robert Joe Wagner in Australia, Luis Garavito in Colombia, Yang Zhihai, China, Ukraine, Anatoly Onoprienko, Russia, Andrei Chikatilo, and many others, Indonesia, Ahmed Surajai. So the idea is there are serial killers from just about every country in the world. This isn't a uniquely American experience, so why do people think it is? And, my reason, or my, explanation for why this happens is the U.S. media. The U.S. media tends to dominate the world, especially if you're looking at movies and books and things like this. So, I kind of talk to the class and I say, when's the last time you watched a foreign film? Now, maybe with Netflix or other streaming services, you see more international films, but for the most part, Americans tend to watch American media made for Americans by Americans in America, right? People all around the world view those same movies, listen to those same podcasts. All this, they share our interest in the American kind of culture, where we don't necessarily do the same. So when somebody like Dahmer or Gacy hits the news, that news goes around the whole world. Where if you have somebody pop up in South Korea or Iran or somewhere else, Moses Sitole in South Africa, it doesn't necessarily make primetime news in the U.S. We're not watching movies about him here, right? So my reason why I think this kind of myth persists, that it's just a U.S. thing, is because the world watches our news, listens to our media, our movies, watches our movies, so they kind of see what's happening here, while we don't necessarily reciprocate. We don't realize what's going on in some of these other places. Now, to some extent, you might say the media in these other countries, maybe they don't focus on it as much as we do. I think it's pretty common knowledge at this point that serial murder and true crime are big in the U.S., right? We have whole networks dedicated to true crime investigation, discovery. We have all kinds of Netflix specials, all kinds of movies that focus on true crime, violence, murder. And, for better or worse, it's one of those if it bleeds, it leads kind of thing. If something violent happens, the media in the U.S. seizes on it, puts it on the front page, and we all kind of learn about these types of activities. So, when we deal with this concept of, is it an American phenomenon? No. There are serial killers in just about every country in the world. It's not a uniquely American experience. All right. There's an epidemic of serial murder in the U.S. At different times, we always like to believe it's worse now than it's ever been before. They're everywhere. There's serial killers coming out of the woodwork. And I think if you looked at the 70s and 80s, you'd say, wow, there's a lot of kind of high-profile killers in these areas. Does that mean that there were more serial killers at that time? Not necessarily. The reality is, at any given time, we have no idea how many serial killers are active, right? Until you catch them, you don't really know. And even if we don't catch them, even if you start linking deaths, you don't necessarily know who else is out there, what the true body count is. Even when we catch serial killers, we don't really know the true body count, how many victims they've truly claimed. So it's hard to gauge whether or not there's more serial killers now than there was at some other time. Now, if you looked at it from a mathematical standpoint, and you said there's 300 and some million people in the U.S. now, in 1820 there wasn't, surely, obviously, there'll probably be more serial killers just based on more people. But if we're looking at it as a proportion, of the population, I don't know that there's more now, or maybe in the 70s or 80s or the 50s or the 20s or in any other time period. So it's hard to gauge whether or not there are more serial killers now. Now, one thing that may make us believe there are more serial killers active now, or in the last few decades, is probably the media attention and advances in policing. So we talk about serial murder. If you were operating in the 1890s and killed somebody in Pennsylvania, and then went to Michigan and killed someone, and went to Ohio and killed someone, and went to Indiana, the chances of the police actually tying those murders together were probably slim and none. I mean, to be honest, even if you were in different counties in the same state, they might not have tied them together. So advances in policing, advances in technology, advances in information sharing can obviously help law enforcement see similarities when we see murders and maybe tie them together. So this is something that you probably didn't have many years ago. So I think, why is there maybe more of a focus now, or why do we realize that there's serial killers now when maybe in the past we weren't as cognizant? I would say it's probably advances in policing and the media. These two things come together to make us more aware of what's going on when it comes to serial killers. All right. Final thing, well, not final, it was the final myth I'll hit. Serial killers are inspired by pornography. This is a myth that kind of came from an interview that happened between Dr. James Dobson, who was a Christian minister, and Ted Bundy shortly before he was executed. So Dr. Dobson was someone who was not an advocate of pornography, to put it lightly, and went to talk to Ted. And these interviews are on YouTube. You can find them out there. And he kind of asks him about, what made you do this, Ted? And Ted kind of recants the story about how he found these pornographic magazines that depicted bondage and all these kinds of, aberrant or abnormal sexual activities. And this is what kind of made him have an obsession with this and pushed him down this path that eventually led to serial murder. The one thing that we know about Ted Bundy is he's a master manipulator. He's a highly intelligent man, but obviously who was quite capable of using people for his own purposes. So if you ask me my opinion, I would say Dr. Dobson was taken for a ride by a highly educated, highly intelligent, and highly manipulative Ted Bundy. Told him what he wanted to hear. And this isn't uncommon. A lot of serial killers would do the same things. I know Netflix had a documentary out recently about Henry Lee Lucas. Similar kind of things. You'll tell people what they want to hear. Why? You usually get something out of it. It's not uncommon for serial killers to confess to more crimes or say they'll disclose where bodies are when they know they need something. So sometimes maybe you're set to be executed on the 30th of the month. So what do? A couple weeks before, you say, hey, listen, guys, there's 2 more bodies I didn't tell you about. I want to disclose where they are. And the hope is, the anticipation here is they're going to postpone my execution. I'll get something out of it. Or maybe you just want to get some kind of, preferential treatment. Sometimes even when you're at the spot where you're negotiating a plea or you're getting ready to go to trial, you might say, look, I'll disclose where the bodies are if you take the death penalty off the table. So there's a certain degree of manipulation, I think, when it comes to dealing with serial killers, and it shouldn't be surprising. If you think about this, these are folks that engage in what most of us would consider, some of the most aberrant behavior one can engage in. You're taking another's life. Not only are you doing it once, you're doing it regularly, right? You're doing it at least 3 times, at least over 30 days if we use our definition. Some of these serial killers go on for years and years and decades even. So you're engaging in this really kind of bizarre behavior, but what do you have to do? You have to hide this. One of the reasons you get to be a serial killer and you don't get caught after the first or second murder is you find a way to compartmentalize this. So basically what you do is you go on with your life and you have an outward appearance that faces the world, while inside you have these kind of deep burning desires that lead you to engage in this kind of activity. So not surprisingly, I think serial killers can at times turn it on and off. So when you engage with somebody like Dr. Dobson and you know that he wants to, he's kind of an anti-porn crusader, you're going to give him exactly what he wants, right? Because it's the attention that Bundy craved. So serial killers are inspired by pornography? Not necessarily. Certainly some are, but not all. Last one, serial killers want to get caught. This, I think, is largely inspired by Ed Kemper and maybe some others who taunt the police. So for the most part, you'd think that if you committed a serious crime and you killed someone, the last thing you'd want to do is tell somebody, right? You'd want to get away with it. And many serial killers do, right? They do this over and over again. They don't tell people. Maybe you get caught via some forensic evidence or something that leads back to you. But for the most part, you don't try to get caught. Now, there are some serial killers that certainly engage with the media and engage with the police. So somebody like BTK, for example, would basically taunt the police, taunt the media. And many would say he wants to get caught. And you could, argue maybe he wants to get caught. But the reality is, I think that this is kind of a game of cat and mouse. So to somebody like Dennis Rader, he thinks he's smarter than the police. He's outwitting them. To be fair, he evaded capture for a number of years, right? It becomes a part of the game, a part of the anticipation. So you kind of have, the stuff that comes with the murders, but you also have this anticipation of this game between you and the police. And I think they derive some sort of pleasure out of it, right? Now, again, if you deal with somebody like Ed Kemper, who's the co-ed killer, he kind of came back into popularity with the Mindhunter series. Kemper was treated very poorly as a young man, always told by his mother, basically, stay away from these girls. They were afraid he was going to rape his young sister, so he was forced to live in a basement. Some really bad stuff happened to him as a young man. But Kemper clearly had issues with his mother. And not surprisingly, as you see with maybe some other serial killers, you have someone in your life who did you wrong or you perceive as doing you wrong. So maybe a girlfriend dumped you or your ex-wife cheated on you or something like this. Instead of killing the ex-wife or the girlfriend or the mother, they kill others. It's kind of proxies for that person. And every time they engage in these activities, you're kind of symbolically killing the mother or the ex-wife or whoever it is, but you're taking it out on these innocent victims. With the example of Kemper, he did eventually kill his mother, and afterwards called the mother and his mother's friend, and then kind of called the police and turned himself in. But that's certainly not, every serial killer. The other thing that's kind of interesting, we talk about Keith Jesperson. If you're not familiar with him, the happy face killer. Jesperson's story is one of the strangest things that have ever happened. Jesperson actually killed a young woman, and another couple took the hit for the murder. Basically, this lady, I don't know if it was her boyfriend or her husband, didn't like him, wanted to break up with him, whatever, called the police and said that he did it, and wound up saying that she was an accomplice, part of it. And the crazy thing is they actually were convicted for the murder. Now, you would think as a serial killer, you'd say, wow, this is my lucky day, right? I've committed a serious offense, and 2 other suckers have taken the rap for me. This is where he got the happy face moniker. He started leaving some notes written in bathroom stalls. He was a truck driver, so he traveled around. And basically said, it is that those folks didn't do it. I did. Here are some details. He left a detail that only the killer would know. And obviously it drew attention away from those two folks and towards maybe the real killer is still out there. So you do have a number of incidents. I mean, even going back to Jack the Ripper, right, with the From Hell letters and this stuff, if we believe they're truly sent by the Ripper. There are lots of incidents where people interact or taunt or try to engage with the media and the police. Does it mean they're trying to get caught? Probably not. For the most part, no. All right, final one, and this is a question I want to ask you all, and I'll talk about my experience a little. Who was the first serial killer that you were aware of, and under what circumstances did you learn of the serial killer? Now, like I said, I've taught this class for a number of years, and honestly, it depends on who's the classroom, what the answers are. When I taught this, the one time I had another professor in the class who was probably 20 years older than I was, and he talked about the Hillside Stranglers and the Son of Sam and people like this. Now, if you were to ask students today who the Hillside Strangler is, Son of Sam, they probably wouldn't know. Maybe they would have heard the name Son of Sam and kind of vaguely know what it is, but they really wouldn't know any of those details. And it kind of comes with this notion of, serial killers, like many other things, are time and place specific. So if you lived in New England or you lived in the South or the West Coast, the likelihood is you probably heard of some serial killer in your area. Others obviously have nationwide and worldwide recognition, Bundy, Dahmer, Gacy, these kind of folks. But in many instances, the first person you learn about is somebody close. So for me, the first serial killer I was aware of was someone called the Frankfurt Slasher. So I grew up in Northeast Philadelphia, in the Frankfurt section of the city. And at that time, there was a serial killer on the loose called the Frankfurt Slasher. Now, as young kids, we were all terrified, and he became the boogeyman. The Frankfurt Slasher is going to get you. In reality, he was stalking victims that were in a bar on Frankfurt Avenue. Most of them probably drug users, engaged in prostitution, maybe these kind of high-risk activities. But it was females being kind of selected from this bar on Frankfurt Ave. We go back to this: is everybody at risk at serial killers? No. I'm a 9-year-old boy. Am I at risk? No, I wasn't. But the fear is there. You believe this person's on the loose. So that would be the first person that I was aware of. What's kind of interesting is someone was arrested and went to prison for the murders, but there is some debate as to whether or not he actually engaged in these killings, and there is actually some debate as to whether or not all of the victims are connected or if these are just different murders that just happen to come out of the same place. The other kind of high-profile person, while not quite a serial killer I was aware of, is Gary Heidnick. I believe his body count was 2. Heidnick is kind of a unique character. He's the last person to be executed in Pennsylvania. He's also the true life inspiration for part of the film Silence of the Lambs. So, I think it's a meme at this point in time where it puts the lotion in the basket. Heidnick actually had holes in his basement where he kept women captive. So part of that film was derived from the real life of Gary Heidnick. Like I said, he had 2 victims, so he doesn't meet the Holmes definition of a serial killer. But these were the first folks that I was aware of. And again, Heidnick was in Philadelphia. So these were people that were in and around me when I grew up. Not me personally, but my city. So they were on my radar. So I guess what I'd like to know is, what was the first serial killer you were aware of? Is it somebody close to home, or is it going to be Jack the Ripper or somebody like that? So if you'd let me know in the comments, I'd greatly appreciate it. I'm going to finish this beer and have a relaxing rest of the afternoon. Hey, thanks for listening. I'm going to do some more episodes. Like I said, we're going to go into some greater depth, and we'll talk about these different categories. So specifically, hedonistic lust, hedonistic thrill, comfort killers, visionary serial killers, power control. And then once we're done all that, we'll actually start talking about serial killers, the activities they engaged in, and then we'll try to classify them based on this system put together by the Holmes. So until next time, have a glorious evening. Stay safe.